Welcome to this webinar. This is the second webinar out of a series we started last month with the series, which is titled Exploring Modernisms. My name is Mira Hirz. I'm the curator of this webinar series, and I will also moderate for you today. I'm also the co-curator of the project that this webinar series is part of. It's an exhibition and research project bringing the Indian modern artist Prabhakar Barwe and the Swiss-German modern artist Paul Klee together. I will in a moment say more about that. But before that, a really huge welcome to our speaker and discussant today. We have Rebecca M. Brown and Jozi Pritzky joining us today, and I will also introduce you in a moment. Before all of this, a few practical things. We have automated captions available. If you want to, you can turn them on. We will be recording this webinar, so if for any reason you can't stay or you want to tell your friends and colleagues about this, you will find the recording afterwards on the YouTube channel of the Goethe-Institut Pune website in a few weeks' time, probably in January. Most important, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to write them into the chat at any point, and we have allocated time at the end of the webinar to come to those as well, and I will collect them throughout. And there will be a short break after Rebecca's presentation of like 5 minutes, and we expect the whole webinar to last around 1.5 or 2 hours, depending on how many questions you have as well. Okay, I say a little bit more about this project that I mentioned. Intersections and Interventions, Prabhakar Barwe and Paul Klee. This project has been running since last year already and is a collaboration between the Goethe-Institut Max Müller Barban Pune, the Zapurza Museum of Art and Culture Pune, and the Zentrum Paul Klee in Bern in Switzerland. The project wants to bring these two artists and their artistic as well as pedagogical ideas into a dialogue. Prabhakar Barwe lived from 1936 to 1995 and actually had his death days just a few days ago. He was a painter of, we could say, the second wave of Indian modernism, and he was based in Maharashtra in India. And then we have Paul Klee, who lived from 1879 to 1940, a Swiss-German modernist painter and teacher at the Bauhaus School in the 1920s in Germany. The idea for this dialogue, and actually the whole project, draws from the fact that in the second half of the 20th century, Klee's work was introduced to Indian art schools, Indian audiences, also to Prabhakar Barwe, and especially to this region, Maharashtra, that he lived in. And it has been noted by artists there, including by Barwe, that Klee's work served as a source of inspiration. The project wants to explore what that meant, having this inspiration, wants to explore this connection and tap into the affinities as well as differences between Barwe's and Klee's work, but also their respective cultural and national contexts, their art schools, and taking that as a starting point, the project, or we want to look at Indian and German modernisms in general. And all of this will then lead to an exhibition of Barwe's and Klee's works in September 2025 next year at the Zapurza Museum of Art and Culture in Pune in India. So if you're around, you can already note that in your calendars. This webinar series, we are having the second webinar today, aims to enable international conversations and wants to tap into concepts of art history, modernisms, abstractionism in a global way. Rather than looking at art history chronologically, we are interested in comparing these artists, as I mentioned, comparing their contexts. Chronology would lead to stories of singular influence. In this case, Barwe lived later than Klee, and Klee's work was introduced to Barwe, so that would mean that Barwe was influenced by Klee, and this would also kind of be the end of the whole story. But for us in this webinar series, this is more a starting point for discussions. How can comparing these two artists lead to maybe more inspiring and productive questions or stories? Looping, circling back and forth, might bring up new perspectives so that Barwe's work could also spark new ideas for how to engage with Klee's work. And the concept for this webinar today, which is titled Modernism and Abstraction, India, Germany, and Switzerland, is a really great example for that, because Rebecca will start by speculating about what if we wrote the history of art as if Paul Klee was from India or Prabhakar Barwe was Swiss German. And after this presentation, as I mentioned, we're going to have a short break, and then Jutze Pritzky will join us for a discussion. And as mentioned, if any of you in the audience have questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat at any point. And now is also a really good moment to introduce our two speakers. Rebecca M. Brown is Professor of the History of Art and Chair of Museum Studies and Cultural Heritage Management Programs at Johns Hopkins University in the US. She specializes in colonial era and modern art, architecture, and visual culture, with particular expertise in South Asia. And with all of that, we are extremely happy that she joins us today. She has published numerous articles, 3 books, and 6 co-edited volumes, and currently she is thinking with the Southern Indian painter K.C. Panikkar, tracing his errand journey to unfold a language of painting in the 1960s and 70s. If you're interested in that, just stay tuned with the upcoming publications of Rebecca. Jutze Pritzky works as research assistant at the Art Historical Institute Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany. Her research focuses on the history of art history, the formation of the discipline, and transcultural and queer feminist artistic modernisms. And I'm really happy that you joins us with that expertise for the discussion. You has published articles on these topics and a book on art historian Stella Kramrich. She is as well co-founding member of the German research foundation network Paths, Methods, Critiques, Women Art Historians in the 1880s to 1970s. And just to mention, last but not least, I'm myself an independent curator and artist, and as mentioned before, I'm co-curating this project. And with that, I'd love to hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mira. That was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to be a part of this project because I think that this kind of comparative questioning is so important to help us refigure the entire history of modernism, not just for South Asia, but I think for the world. So this is exciting. And I wanted to thank you all as well for joining us. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to the Goethe-Institut in Pune, the Zapolza Museum, and the Zentrum Paul Klee as well for hosting this webinar and the project. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So my provocation for this talk is as follows. What if we considered Paul Klee an Indian artist? What if we imagine him not as a distant influence, but a fellow traveler, living and developing in India alongside those who read his pedagogical sketchbook, saw his works, thought about his framing of modernism and the problems of line, shape, and color? Maybe we might think of it as more of a Klee spirit haunting India. Klee often comes up in conversations with artists from India, so this provocation is not at all far-fetched. And to be clear, and I think Mira mentioned this earlier, I do not mean this as a kind of simplistic relation of influence in which the Indian artist comes out as a derivative player, only imitating some distant European master. Instead, I want to take seriously the deep imbrications of Klee in its complexities, matching the intensity and seriousness of so many artists around the world who found resources in his writing and in his painting. Indian artists, like artists everywhere, can take inspiration from where they find it and take guidance from fellow artists no matter where they are from. And so the project then is to honor the Klee spirit that inflects many artists in India. A side effect of this provocation, as I hope will become clear in the works I'm going to share with you today, is to reconsider a central term for 20th century art worldwide: abstraction. Many of you will have an idea of what abstract art looks like, but I imagine that if we all on this webinar and in future viewings of this, if everyone closed their eyes and imagined the quintessential abstract work of art, we would all have something slightly different in mind. And many of us, myself included, would think, I have no idea what the quintessential example of abstraction really is. So let's put our imagined pure abstract work of art aside for a minute and look at what artists are actually doing instead. What kinds of problems are they navigating in their work? How can we unpack these problems? And how might thinking with Paul Klee help us and these artists in navigating their artistic problems? So, part of this bigger question means that what we're trying to do a little bit here is recentering the history of 20th century art on something like a clay-inflected abstraction in India. So I want to work through this question with three of Klee's own trajectories. First, landscape, the garden, plants and animals. Then writing, symbols and line. And third, icon and color. And after looking at this gathering of works, and this is somewhat idiosyncratic, I will warn you, because it's some of my favorites. And I think that it's sort of an example rather than prescriptive. That is, one can do these kinds of comparisons across a number of different artists, across a number of different regions. But after looking at this particular gathering of works, we'll end by connecting these threads to politics and to history, something that underlies these artistic questions pursued by the artists I'm gathering together today. We won't come away with a comprehensive history of abstraction or modernism in India here. What would that even mean? And how could we possibly do that in 45 minutes or so? Nor will we end with a definitive example of that imaginary abstract work of art. But we might end with a heightened awareness of the Klee spirit, one that I think helps us attune our senses to artistic questions that move across time and space to help us grapple with history and with politics. Okay, so let's look at some amazing works of art. So this is Barwe, the artist who centers Mira's project in relation to Klee. And I want us to just take a look at this painting because one of the things I've always noticed about many abstract paintings, or paintings that are considered abstract, I should say, since we're putting that term in question, is that they often start from a kind of landscape sensibility. So my first theme here is landscape or nature in quotations, or plants and animals. And you can see all of these things in this particular painting, which is done on silk, which is why you can see the strands of the underlying fabric itself. So there's a materiality to this painting. And then you can see a mountain, maybe a mountain shape. The horizontality of the horizon is given to you multiple times over. And then you can see a half circle, a full circle, perhaps indicating a moon, a sun, maybe a reflection. And then up at the top, kind of interrupting the language of the rest of the painting, which is fairly broad, flat color. You have these small, little, decorative, beautifully rendered flowers that seem to have come off of an embroidery or a textile in some way. So we have the textile of the silk coming through and then echoed by the gesture of almost embroidered imagery up at the top. And I think what's interesting about this painting to me is it's both abstract and actually completely not abstract, correct? Because at the top, you have these sort of very detailed flowers. This is a kind of stylized flower, but it's not abstract. We can understand them as flowers. So this is one of the things that I always find interesting about abstraction, is that it's very rarely fully unconnected from anything. It's almost always connected to things, whether it's the materiality, whether it's the imagery, whether it's the horizon or the landscape or some sort of atmosphere. So this is something that we're going to see again and again as we think about the ways in which artists grapple with artistic problems, meaning problems that Klee would have talked about in his pedagogical sketchbook, which circulated in India, as Mira mentioned, after World War II and after independence, among artists who turn to it to think about color, to think about lines, to think about the relation between different parts of the painting. So here I'm just putting Barwe in dialogue with Paramse, who is another artist of this period, the second half of the 20th century from India. And many of the same kinds of gestures are in his Metascape series. This is one of a series that he did. And so you have the really bright red gesture coming off of the left, interrupting the horizontality of some of the other lines. And you have the punctuation mark, right, of the sun in the landscape. So this can be a representational painting if you like, but it also is very much refusing representation as it's pushing against those kinds of, as it's pushing towards the kind of color bands that you see in the Barwe. And for me, these gestures are related to things that Paul Klee also did in his painting. And it should just say that I'm not saying that these artists are looking at this particular painting or that this particular painting inspired them or that they even knew about this particular painting. Paul Klee painted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of works. In fact, it's kind of astounding how many Paul Klee works there are. And it's what I see in this comparison is more of a way of thinking about the surface of the painting, about the arrangement of elements on that surface. So you have blocks of color, but you still have gestures to an actual cityscape or landscape. So you can see in the top left of the Klee painting a small gesture to a tree. The painting is called Balloon. So you then, because of the title, Red Balloon, you read that circular form as a balloon, but one could equally read it as a kind of gesture to a celestial body. As soon as you see the tree, you think of balloon, perhaps then the square shapes and triangles coalesce into a kind of cityscape. So again, it's abstract, but it's also slipping away from that. And then the other things that the Barwe and Paramse gestures and the Klee gestures suggest to me are these two paintings. One is from South Asia, Shakir Ali, who is from present-day Pakistan. And then the other is actually from South Korea. Kim Hwang-ki was one of the major painters of the 1950s and 60s and 70s in South Korea. And here I just want to emphasize the ways in which landscape can tap into a kind of connective tissue of being human in the world. One of the things that Shakir Ali was trying to think about in his painting, where you can see this really bright red ground with a horizontal bar that indicates the landscape, and then a celestial body named the moon in the title up above. One of the things he was trying to think about, and I think that Kim Hwang-ki is also trying to think about, is that these celestial bodies are available to be seen, to be shared across lines and boundaries that get drawn by human actors, like the line of partition, for example, between Pakistan and India, which is, you can see in the Shakir Ali painting as a kind of crack across the red that transcends the ground of the landscape, but doesn't actually fully go through the moon directly. It actually goes diagonal through the moon. And similarly, Kim Hwang-ki is living in a place in 1960 in Korea that also has had a massive division and has had a rending of families and people. And so it too, I think, gestures both to a long history of landscape painting in East Asia, but also to this shared sensibility, this shared body in the sky of the moon. So in addition to the abstraction of the landscape, and sometimes, as we see here as well with Klee, the abstraction of the cityscape, we also have the appearance of birds and animals. And actually, birds sort of emerge in Klee quite often. I was actually lucky enough to see an entire exhibition in Bern a few years ago called Tierisches, connected to his animals in his paintings, and this work was in that show. But here you can see he's repeating this gesture of the celestial body, perhaps the sun or perhaps the moon in that red disk. We've got these sketchy trees, geometric trees. We've got a little bit of what look like roof lines. And then we have this odd onion. I think of it as an onion. I don't know what it actually is. An onion root kind of form in the middle. So the sun kind of becomes plant, right? Which actually does happen that way. And then we have these almost ciphers or codes for crow. These are birds, again, like the moon, that exist all over the world in different forms. One can find a crow or a raven-like bird in a huge number of places around the world. And so in some ways, there's a kind of universality to these creatures. And Paul Klee has given us a kind of symbol for crow, a cipher of crow, such that the crow almost becomes abstract on the surface of the painting as well. And we can see this too, both in Barwe on the left, in one of his later landscape paintings entitled Landscape, where you see a tiny little bird. Over to the left, you see some feathers, and some leaves. So there are elements here that are, in this case, taken out of their context. That's the sort of way in which they're abstracted and placed on this very stark background. And I put this in dialogue with Jagdish Swaminathan's painting because, like, Swaminathan actually has a repeated trope of the bird and the stone or rock or mountain and the tree. And the bird and the round oval shape that you see up at the top of Swaminathan's painting repeats quite often in his work. And I think both of these paintings give us a sense of another way in which artists can think about abstraction, can think about elemental forms that are in our landscape or in our cityscape, in our urban environments, and take them out of those spaces and put them in different contexts to make us look at them anew. So for Barwe, that's more of a lived environment. It feels more like a city or I don't know, a house where you have different pathways and different kinds of built environments that he's arranging on the surface. For Swaminathan, it's much more looking to a natural environment that maybe is less engaged with by the human. But in both cases, they are taking us out of the everyday, taking us to another plane of existence, another way of looking at the world. And I think that's another element that these discs of the celestial, the image of the crow, that those things can come together in these kinds of paintings. And then, as Mira mentioned, I've been working for several years on a project that actually puts KCS Panikir, the painter from South India, based in and around Madras, that puts him in dialogue with Paul Klee as well. And so here I just note that he too is working with similar kinds of elements, with a tree, with the crow. One could look at this painting and say, but wait a second, this is not at all abstract. I can see everything here, I can identify things, and you would be right. But at the same time, it is a little bit slipping away from anything that would be representational. The gesture at the bottom is a river, but it also echoes with snake imagery. The tree is a tree, but it also is sort of white pigment on the surface, which is actually aluminum. And the amazing teardrop shaped um, the teardrop shaped leaves are leaves, perhaps, or maybe they're water drops, but it's actually kind of unclear, right? So we have all of these elements together combining. And then what is going on with all of these symbols? So one of the things that I think Panikkar, Barwe, Paul Klee, that they're all playing with is this edge of abstraction. How do we these places where we are not quite sure of what we're looking at? And I think that's a very interesting place to live. And there are, I think, very real political and historical reasons why one would be exploring those edges. And so that's something that I want to return to here. And that I just want to sort of shift to our next theme by looking back at two of Paul Klee's garden images, really. On the left is a work titled Tree Nursery. On the right is Flowers on Stone, or Flowers in Stone. And here, I think you can see that there's a shift, or there's an emphasis on the symbol, or the sort of the cipher, a small set of gestures that signals but doesn't actually depict tree, or that signals and doesn't actually depict flower. And so you can see on the tree nursery, a nursery would have rows and rows and rows of trees. So he's giving us this kind of almost grid-like, but very horizontal, still kind of a landscape, receding, feel like it's receding into the distance. It's repeatable, but each little gesture, each little cipher is slightly different. So each tree is slightly different. And then on the right, he's given us flowers, but they're not flowers, right? They're X's and O's with pigment in them. So they're very sketchy. They're very distant from what an actual visual image of a flower might look like in a photograph, for example. So we move from, we think about Klee himself, Panikkar, Barwe, the other artists I've shown you so far, are thinking about this move from landscape, which is not quite nature. It's always engaged with by animals and humans. So in some ways, what I like to think of this, I'd like to think of this as more of a garden scape than a landscape. It helps us to get away from this idea that nature is somehow untouched, because it never is. So they are looking at gardens and trying to unpack what it means to be in relation to that natural world. So my second theme, which, as you could see from that previous Klee set of works, is related, is this question of the symbol and writing and line. And this is, again, something that Klee was very much involved in. And I'm starting you out here with one of my favorite KCS Panikkar paintings, because I think it helps us to see what's at stake in this question of text and writing on paintings. One of the things that Klee talked about, or that he tried to articulate, especially in the pedagogical sketchbook, which a lot of artists around the world were looking at, is this idea of a language of painting, or of the way in which one uses the elements of painting to add up to a pictorial answer, I suppose, a pictorial conversation. Let's put it, it's not really an answer. And so here we have Panikkar actually building up the ground of his painting with two very large brown lozenge forms across that are, again, horizontal. And I just want to keep returning to this idea that there's also a sensibility of landscape, of groundedness, of looking out to a horizon. And then on top of that, that very brushy surface that continues to kind of move underneath. And I want you to pay attention to that. We have symbols of various kinds, and they are organized around passages of what looks like writing. And one of the things that Panikkar was very much known for is this writing on his canvases that actually cannot be read usually. Sometimes you can pick out a word or two or a letter or two, but it cannot be read. And he wanted it to not be read. He wanted it to be almost legible, but not quite. So again, this gives you a sense of that slippage between knowing and being able to read it no problem and actually not knowing. And each of the gestures that he's got on this painting, whether it's an asterisk form or the scribbles that can't be read, or a chart with diagrams in it and little symbols in it, or an icon of what looks kind of like a god. Some of you will, I'm sure, be thinking, oh, I know that's Ravana up in the top right. Absolutely, it gestures to a whole range of deities and asura images, but at the same time, it's not, right? It slips out of those things. It's a gesture to something much broader, or to many different images. And so I think that this is something that artists have grappled with across the world, and have used the question of writing to inform, to get us to think about how we know what we know, and to get us to think about the sort of difficulty of communication, the difficulty of connecting with other people through the method of language. And so just to give you a sense of the Paul Klee side of this, Klee had a whole range of different approaches to writing in his paintings and in his works. One thing to note is that he almost always wrote the title of the work at the bottom. And often those titles were quite long. So you can see at the left, the title is quite long because he's actually just writing out the entirety of the text that is also in the painting. And you can get a sense here of the ways in which he's using color and the size of the text and the background to make this text difficult to read. Here, this is actually readable, but it's quite difficult to figure out what the letters are. So it's not, you have to take your time, you have to slow down. You could also see that the translation of the text is in the caption, high and brightly shining stands the moon. And so you have a moon up at the top, right? This is also a landscape. It's a text and it's a landscape. So thinking about the ways in which the approaches to abstraction start to blend together, start to merge. He also did a series of abstract writing. So this is, again, his attempt to think about the edges of legibility, the edges of writing. What does it mean to make a gesture that looks like writing, but actually isn't readable? Is it still writing? Is it still language? Is it still trying to communicate? And this is something that a lot of philosophers have really grappled with in terms of both art, in terms of Paul Klee himself, but also just in terms of what is the edge of purposive writing versus scribbles, mark making. Where does communication lie? Where does language lie? And here are two additional examples from Paul Klee. Another of these these poem paintings, basically, where he's using the form of the letter as a way of exploring the edges of legibility of language. The other thing that Paul Klee often did was to use single letters in his works. Often they refer to things in his life or people in his life. Sometimes they are gestures to music, as in this case on the right. So here, for me, the background behind the letters on the right looks a lot like a kind of patchwork of a garden. Similarly, on the left, the lozenges, the squares of color also have a resonance of, say, a field of tulips, for example. So there is a definite, for me, connection to nature, to growth, to life in a lot of these works, even as they are trying to unpack something very human, which is writing. One of the other artists that I think is in dialogue with some of these moves that Klee is making, that Panikkar is making, is Cy Twombly. And in dialogue with, I don't mean that they knew each other or that they knew of each other. They almost certainly did not. But Cy Twombly is an artist who, for much of his career, was thinking about the ways in which writing slips away from comprehension. He's an American who spent much of his time in Italy, actually. And so a lot of his works, as in this series, there are 24. I'll show you there are the 24. I think that's almost all of them. He did this series of 24 poems to the sea. And none of you can parse out numbers occasionally. Sometimes there's an actual word. Like I think you can read "what" in the middle of the image on the right. But I want you to notice he's put a horizon line across the top of both of these. He's scribbled, but then also used paint as a gesture, almost like it's the wind or some sort of atmospheric element. And so I think there's ways in which he's trying to get across the idea of what would it be to have a poem that was also a painting? What would it mean to have painting as poetry? And this is something that I think we should take on board when we're thinking about some of these other artists from across Europe, from across South Asia, to think about the ways in which poetry, spoken words, also are part of this idea of writing, of thinking, of knowing. And the other artist, I keep coming back to South Korea, that engages with writing in his work, that I think is productively put in dialogue with some of the experiments that Twombly, K.C.S. Panikkar, Klee, others are working through, is Park Seo-woo. And he initially titled this series Myeolbop, but then changed it to Écriture when he learned about various movements in France. And I think this is a very different approach to writing, right? So here we have a repetitive gesture that goes up and down, that then forms a kind of pattern across the surface that's almost like an optical puzzle. As you move closer and further away, it actually changes quite significantly. And the way he makes these paintings is they're big canvases, as you can see on the left. That's my attempt to show it to you in the gallery setting. They're big canvases with that cream colored oil paint, and then he takes a stylus and does the writing with the stylus, cutting through the paint. So there's also a three-dimensionality to this, and you can really see his hand working as you get closer. And so I think there's something about the presence of the human here, even in abstraction. That is, often we think of abstraction as distant from the human form, as distant from landscape, which I hope you will agree it's not, as distant from representation. Certainly it's distant from representation, but it's not distant from the body of the artist or our bodies as we move closer and further away from the painting. And Park Seo-woo gives me a nice segue back into South Asia, via Nasrin Mohammadi. And her work is often compared with Agnes Martin's work, US-based, US artist from a similar period, from the second half of the 20th century. But I think that the relation to Park Seo-bo and the question of écriture is also quite compelling, in the sense that both of them, in very different ways, she's working on paper with pen and ink and with a lot of tools to create those very straight lines. The relation here is about the human hand on the surface of the paper, and about the very materiality of that paper, similar to the painting I opened with by Barwe on silk. This, I think, is purposively very particular in terms of the ways in which she's choosing the paper she's working on, the ink that she's using, the weight of the ink across the page, and the very precision of this kind of gesture across the paper, the square paper. These are, again, maybe this is the kind of thing that when you closed your eyes at the beginning and you imagined an abstract work of art, this is sort of what you were thinking, right? But I think the other thing about to know about Nasreen Mohammedi's work is that it too is grounded in space, is grounded in pattern and landscape in the built environment. This is one of her photographs that she took during a trip to Fatehpur Sikri. And you can see that instead of the photograph on the left is the one that I would use to sort of teach Fatehpur Sikri with. And you can see the steps down into the water area in the middle of the courtyard. But she hasn't given us that picture on the left. She's given us this picture where she's tilted the camera down, and now you have the pattern of the pavement, and you have this break through the pavement of the water course that goes across in a geometric way. And I think that, these kinds of photographs, she also has a photograph of a loom, for example, help us to see the way that she's thinking about the world around her and integrating it into her meditations on the landscape, on the horizontal line. For example, in both of these works, there's a moment where there's a break, just a small extra space, right, between the horizontal lines. And that operates much like Cy Twombly's blue line across the top of his poems, or like Barwe's horizontality that we opened with. And it gives us an anchor into a kind of space of the world, of landscape. And then the diagonals that she uses give us that recession, that idea of recession into space, give us a little bit of movement, allow our eyes to think about the ways in which we might think of, for example, on the right, the surface might be undulating into the distance. So again, there's a sense of writing here, of pencil on paper. There's a sense of drawing, but there's also a sense of space and of landscape. And I just wanted to show you a very early Mohammedi painting as well. This is from about 1960, so that you can also see that her own artistic practice is grounded in plants, is grounded in water, is grounded in trying to parse the ways in which we have ciphers of trees, ciphers of plants. So you might be thinking, oh yeah, I remember I saw those same diagrams in that clay painting of the tree nursery that she showed us. Absolutely. I don't think that Nasreen necessarily saw that painting, but I think there's a kind of echo of similar kinds of problems that Clay is working out, that she is here working out as well. So, and you can see many of these gestures show up in some of her later, more the pencil drawings, more geometric drawings as well. Okay, so as I shift to my sort of third theme here, the icon, I just want to remind us that abstraction, even when it's just a line, even when it feels very abstract, is still, I think, connected to the body, to the world, to the landscape. So one might think it's more obvious that that's the case if we're looking at actual forms that look like heads, right? Forms that look like humans, whether that's a mask-like form or an icon-like form, a murti of some kind. And so it seems like this is not abstract. Like now this is just representational, right? But actually, I would argue that these two are hovering, shimmering on the border between representation and abstraction. And in that sense, they are perfect for enabling us to have that kind of transcendent moment of worship in front of an icon or murti, to get a taste of what it would mean to be in touch with that otherworldly sensibility of faith, of spirituality, of transcendence. And I think that that's partly what abstraction can do in all of its forms, is help us to move past the mundane, the everyday, to bring that mundaneness up into something like transcendence. It helps us to find a language for things that cannot be described or things that cannot be fully understood. So here I'm putting together for you Paul Klee, one of his works, and Madhvi Parikh, who's a painter who is self-taught, but actually is self-taught through Paul Klee's sketchbook. So she had the book, was given the book actually by her husband, also an artist, Manu Parikh, who encouraged her very much to experiment with drawing, painting, art making. And she developed a very rich practice of painting, and very much has a connection to Paul Klee, a direct connection to Paul Klee in many respects. So I paired these two because she has in her practice, she often turns to this kind of, shoulder up head image that is actually built up of different forms that she plays with all the time. In fact, on the right, you can see that kind of curvy vase-like form. You can see similar forms around the central figure that echo that form. So she uses similar kinds of gestures to build up her figures. Similarly, Klee often works in these kinds of color passages that are built up to create his central figure. And one of the things that I have done in my work is take Parikh, who very much worked through Paul Klee, and Panikkar, who actually at one point says, Paul Klee is my guru, Paul Klee is my teacher, and I'm not going to try to imitate him, but he's there sort of in the background constantly for Panikkar. So thinking about the ways in which the two of them are using Indic imagery, for sure, right? This is Kaliyadaman on the right from Madhvi Parikh. On the left, you can see all kinds of gestures to snakes, to tridents, to other kinds of iconic figures within an Indic context, but also then geometry and other things that are much beyond anything that would be anchored in any particular geography. But they're both using a layering of symbols and a layering of color, a layering of dots and gestures. In Panikkar's case, there's writing and diagrams. In Parikh's case, there's symbols hovering in each of the sort of figures. And so I wanted to just do a little bit of a dive into this painting. This is a monumental painting. You can see from the dimensions that it's quite large. But just sort of, I want to focus on this left part of the painting and give you a sense of the ways in which I see her dialoguing with Paul Klee, in addition to the ways that you might have already seen. So one of the things that Klee does, he has a series of these kinds of drawing paintings on the left, where you have kind of sketchy lines going across, and then figures and symbols are kind of caught in the lines the lines themselves are threads, and the symbols are kind of pulling them down. Sometimes it also looks like musical staves. And you can see Parekh doing similar things in that sort of snake river form on the right. So this is one of the elements that she, I think, looks to Klee, engages in dialogue with Klee. The other thing that happens to Klee at the end of his life, so he dies in 1940, and in the last few years of his life, his paintings take on this very prominent dark black outline. And this is, again, something that I think Parekh is noticing and is picking up on, or is dialoguing with Klee around. So you can sort of see that in both of these works. The other thing you can see is this attentiveness to pattern, and the use of pattern as a kind of background form that enables the whole painting to take on a kind of shimmering texture. And this is absolutely something that Parekh does throughout her work, and that I think Klee also is doing in trying to make the surface very much dynamic. So Klee works in those big lozenges of color in earlier periods of his work, and then in this sort of part of his work, he has this kind of shimmering pattern. There's also, I didn't want to leave you with the sense that this is just about painting, so I have a few sculptors in here. And Raghav Kaneria is one who also worked on the images of pathway icons. He's looking at pathway icons in his native Gujarat, and also in Rajasthan and elsewhere. He's also looking at images of Hanuman, again, who are often sort of covered with foil, covered with paint, decorated in various ways. And he actually breaks matkas, the sort of the vessels, the water vessels, and then takes the pieces and some other found objects and makes them into his own set of icons, as you see on the right. And again, this is about a kind of transcendent experience of seeing the deity, that you can get a sense, both he and Paul Klee are trying to think about the ways in which one can abstract a human form, one can abstract a mask or a face, and think about the elemental qualities of that. Kaneria is also using materials very proposively. So the matte terracotta of the vessel combined with the shiny foil that so many of the pathway icons include. Other artists, I wanted to include Kaneria's fellow artist at Baroda and friend Jyoti Bhatt, who worked also on the human form. So in some ways, this is very much a figural image, but took the profile as his particular approach, and then filled it in these two prints with images, the peacock on the left, which is actually taken from a photograph, and text. So there's writing all throughout here that is both readable and unreadable. And when you start looking at these works, you can see that it's sort of layered and layered and layered. So we have a kind of, again, a slipping away from legibility into something that feels much more like almost like a mantra, especially since on the right, he's using a kind of Tibetan script form for the large text that you see there. So it definitely feels like a sort of prayer. It's almost like these heads are thinking, right? That this is what we could, if we could read these texts, we would read what the person was inside their head. right? So this idea of the locus of knowledge, the locus of thinking, being the face or the head. And Barwe too looks at the human form and rethinks it, abstracts it. So this is an undated work called Contemplation. So again, about thinking, about knowledge, about knowing, in which he's got the head as the center of that idea of thinking, but then he's included the torso, the body, he's included a geometric form. Maybe that's something that the person's trying to think through. And then he's included a celestial body or something that suggests maybe a seed or something floating in the air. And these artists are not alone in trying to think about the ways in which a portrait or an image of a person might anchor something that is abstract. So I bring here F.N. Souza, whom some of you may have already been thinking about in relation to these heads, to give us a sense of the range of painterly abstraction that can also be actually about a portrait. And then the other icon that came to mind as I was thinking about abstraction and icons was actually the sculptures of Mrinalini Mukherjee. This image is from the exhibition that she had at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2019, where I was able to see so many of her amazing works. But here you get a sense of her abstraction through textile forms, through the building up of these massive sculptural heavy objects, but also the ways in which they are very much living forms. So again, what's interesting to me is that we keep coming back to nature, to landscape, to growth. These feel like flowers, they feel like seeds. They have bodily references, of course, but they also are very much icons. They're sort of things that you stand in front of and are in awe of, and feel like you almost have to worship them. Like this is the sensibility that they sort of evoke, at least in me. So. And I wanted to alert you that also Raghav Kanerian, in some of his other work, also deals with the question of growth and seed in his sculpture. So these are some of his works that he did for his diploma course in the late second half of the 1960s when he was in London at the Royal College of Arts. So again, seeds that are abstracted, growth that is abstracted, that gets melded into a kind of almost not quite industrial, but into a kind of sense of a pipe or a found form or something that might be human made. And I think this question of icon of centered image, as you can see here, this is called centrifugal memorial page. But in the center are two letters, E and I, which in German read as egg. So you have this central form around an egg, something about growth, something about generation, something about a seed, right? And in many respects, I see this as akin to the maneuvers that someone like S.A. Shraza makes in terms of thinking about the bindu in a tantric context, bindu meaning seed. And the bindu is that dark black center of a mandala, out of which the entirety of the earth, the entirety of the cosmos grows. And so to think about the ways in which the artists across the world are grappling with elemental questions, but also thinking about them in terms of an artistic question, which for me is about creation. What is creativity? How do we create something from materials? And in some ways, growth and seed and landscape are all part of that that question, are all at the root of that question. All right, I'm going to just skip ahead here because I just want to review a little bit and get to my conclusion so that we have time for questions. So as I was saying, the three broad themes that I just wanted to touch on, and I hope that you've gotten a sense now that for me, abstraction doesn't so much exist. I think that it's an important term to play with, but I'm not sure that it ever fully exists. So you have the landscape as one sort of connective tissue that we have talked about in this context. You have writing and words and symbols as well as a kind of abstracted a direction that one can go in to find abstraction, to find the edge between meaning and illegibility, to find the edge of language. And here's another example here in terms of the Mohammedi and Park-Serbo comparison. And then you have the question of the icon, the question of how do we get at this border between the living mundane world and the transcendent world, whether that's through thought and ideas, whether that's through going inside the human body, whether that's through thinking about the deity and something beyond us. And so one of the things that I talk about in my Panikkar project is the ways in which his work enables us to see some of these artistic questions, some of these questions of the language of painting all at once. So he's thinking about he's asking us to come to the painting and really, really look. And all of these artists are doing that. They're drawing us in by making us wonder about what that scribble is. Can I read that? It kind of looks like Malayalam, but I don't know Malayalam, or maybe I do, but I can't read it, or maybe I can pick out a letter. And is that a bird? Or what is that? Is that a trident? Are we looking at something that's Saivite here? Is it a bowl? Is there a geometric diagram in that painting? He draws us in with all of these things. And then he also underscores that with the kind of milky, creamy underlayer, right? It almost looks like he's scribbling these things on a wall that has had multiple graffiti and other kinds of paint over it over time. So there's an aged quality to this. There's an ancientness to this. And we come away wondering what we're supposed to take out of this. How are we supposed to understand this? And part of what we're supposed to get out of this is exactly that feeling, is that feeling of, oh, I actually can't ever know for sure, but this is giving me a sense of that wonderful movement out of my own sensibility. I'm being challenged here. And I think a lot of the artists in that I've shown you, but also just a lot of the artists who are grappling with questions of abstraction, this is the kind of thing that they are interested in. So let me go back here for 1 second. The other thing that I think I want to just emphasize here with Panikkar, and I promised you that I would come back to the relation to politics for some of these artists. And for Panikkar here, one of the things I see operating is precisely the question of language politics in South Asia. So he's painting in the 60s and the 70s. And this is a time of heightened anti-Hindi agitation in the South and heightened sort of Tamil pride around the Tamil language, but also around Dravidian languages in general. And it was a very violent movement as well as being a political movement. And so I want to just suggest here that part of what Panikkar is grappling with is this idea of the multiplicity of languages in South Asia and across the world, but particularly when you have multiple languages sort of jostling for precedence in a culture, where lots of people in Tamil Nadu could speak multiple languages, at least partially, right? So it kind of, how do we understand language fluency in a context where everybody is only partially speaking a language, right? And so this work, I think, too, is helping us to think about the ways in which communication across languages, across time, across cultures might fall short, but also might work, because we can each get something out of this painting. We can each see something in this painting. So there's a way in which he's trying to say, look, we have language systems that are connected. Let's use them. Let's build bridges through them. And likewise, I think that the landscape question, the question of seed, which has been so important throughout what I've been talking about, is about a relation between the human and nature. Canaria grew up in an agricultural context in rural Gujarat. So his experience of seed and plant and growth is very much about a kind of the struggle of the rural farmer. And in some ways, the struggle of the artist to produce art that speaks to people. This is a parallel struggle of creation. And similarly, Mohammedi, who starts working in these kind of watery vegetal forms, moves into a more arid landscape form that echoes some of her experiences in desert landscapes and also at the sea, at the edge of the sea, right, between water and sand. The flatness of the sand, the flatness of the water. And so I think there's something about paying attention to the landscape that we can very much take on board in our contemporary politics around climate change and the landscape. And then, as I mentioned before, I think that there's something very poignant about the land when it is divided artificially, when you have truly abstract lines, like the dividing line of nations, having very real and violent and present and continuing material effects on families, on people who are torn asunder because of this ostensibly abstract, unmaterial line. And so this idea of partition, of division, of dividing families, dividing people, and yet the moon, the sun, the celestial realm is still shared by those people on Earth. So I want to leave you with a story from class that I taught several years ago. I was teaching a modern Indian art class, and I wanted to introduce them to Tayyab Mehta, whom you see on the left. And I mentioned to them, this is a class in the US, I'd mentioned that he had been transformed by coming to the US in the late 60s and seeing a Barnett Newman painting. And I looked out over my class and I realized that there was no recognition at all of who Barnett Newman was. None of my students had any idea. And so I had to reset, and I said, okay, we're going to learn about Barnett Newman by looking at Tayyab Mehta. And so what I did was think about the ways in which Mehta's diagonal, this diagonal across the painting that you see here, which is something that he repeated again and again in his work, and is something that is indeed coming out of the rending of the nation, the rending of politics, and the sort of destruction of both actual human bodies and human families and things like this. But I thought about how we might think about Shakir Ali, about Tayyab Mehta, and their use of the line across the canvas and take that and look at Barnett Newman's work, who is a well-known in the US, at least. He's a canonical abstract painter. He might have been one of the people you thought about when you closed your eyes and thought about an abstract painting. He does these color field paintings and with these lines down them that he calls zips. This is one of his Stations of the Cross on the right. And in this painting, one of the things that he's trying to do, scholars talk about him in terms of the ways in which his work articulates a kind of emphasis on the line as a divider and as a connector. They talk about it more in a kind of formal sense. But one of the things that he was dealing with in his zip paintings, and particularly in the Stations of the Cross paintings, and there are, I believe, 14 of them, were what he wanted to address. How do we actually make work after World War II, after the Holocaust, after so much destruction and division? How do we continue on? And so he, like Shakir Ali, like Tayyab Mehta, is grappling with this idea of the division of the line that is both abstract and also very much present. And so it's this that I sort of want to leave you with, in the sense that that comparative method that Mira was talking about at the beginning. If we think of Paul Klee as an Indian artist, if we think of the Paul Klee spirit as operating in India, then perhaps we can unpack and explode the very idea of abstraction. It's not about just a formal experimentation with line and color and composition, as we might, and it is that, but it's also enabling us to see things about the 20th century and about politics and our lives that are shared across, not the same, but are shared in some ways across the world. And it helps us perhaps to see Barnett Newman in a new light. And this, for me, is very helpful in rethinking our approach to Indian art in general, which so often emphasizes a stark difference between abstraction and representation, or abstraction and figuration. And I think we should refocus. We should not think about that so much. And instead, with Klee's example of the vast variety of types of work that he did, we can start to see the ways in which Indian artists are experimenting on the edge of abstraction, on the edge of language, on the edge of landscape. So that is what I want to leave you with. And I really welcome all of your questions, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you so much. What a variety of works we've seen, of artists, of different countries to dive in. Thank you so much for that. And I'm very tempted to dive in immediately. But let's take a 5-minute break and then go into the discussion together with you as well. So thank you, and I'll see you all in 5 minutes. Thank you again, Rebecca, so much for this incredible presentation, but I would love to hand over to you immediately now. And if you want to start with a comment or question to open this discussion.
Yes, so hello also from my side. And thank you, Mira, for the invitation, the whole project behind it, including all the partners. And thank you, Rebecca, for your incredibly inspiring talk. I really, really enjoyed. And I'm really inspired still by seeing all those images, and also the way that you combined them and that you helped us see connections, connecting threads running through paintings that we might not see together. I will start with a very brief recap. Before then diving into maybe 4 questions or 4 kind of topics that we could talk about. And Mira, I'm relying on you for timing. So if I speak too much, or if Rebecca and I speak too much, and you want to give the floor to others, just always stop us. All right. So this talk, Rebecca, I think you ended on saying that this opposition between abstraction and figuration that's often made for South Asian modern art is really not helpful when trying to understand what the artists did and wanted to do with their work. And I find that incredibly helpful because it really shows, and you really showed, how abstraction and figuration are rather a spectrum than being two different and two opposed poles and two opposed modes. And you showed us this slipping forth and back between abstraction and figuration through the themes of the gardenscape and the animals, in particular the crows. And I loved how you detected these little crows in the different images. We might come back to one of those. Then you moved on to poetry and symbols and talked about the language and communication and how there's always an interest in playing with the edges of the understandable and playing with the edges of what we think we know, and then we look closer at a specific symbol as a specific sign, realize, oh, it actually is not what it seems to be. But maybe there's something else that we can detect. And then the third topic were the icons and the masks, which brought us the closest to figuration, I think. But again, even here, you showed that they were not simply representations of human forms or of specific human forms, and even if they represent human forms, they can still stand in as a signifier for something transcendental. So even if there's a recognizable face, it might point towards something beyond the human. It might help the human to transcend the kind of humanly world. And all the images you used in your talk to lead us through your argument were kind of haunted by Klee's spirit, because the artists you picked and you chose, many of them, particularly the South Asian ones, were very well familiar with Klee's work, as you've pointed out in multiple instances. So before I now come to my questions, I thought we could try the experiment you asked us to do regarding close your eyes, think of an abstract work. Close your eyes and think of a South Asian modern work. Now you might think of something abstract, but if we would have done this before your talk, I'm sure me and many in the audience would have thought of something figurative, which really shows how important your approach is for the field of South Asian art history and how important your focus on abstraction is. So thank you for that. I'm briefly going to scratch my kind of four topics very roughly, and then we'll go through them one by one. The first one, I will think and ask about how important the political dimension is for looking at these abstract work. How much do we need to know? And how does what we see changes by what we know, which also connects with your second topic about the icons and the symbols and the knowledge. Then in the second point, I would like to talk about the materiality used and kind of a tension between an ancientness and an industrial world in which these artists in the 70s worked. And the third point, I'd like to talk about a gendered dimension of abstract art. And then at the end, maybe we can try to think about some words. I know this is part of your project for Panika, that you think about words with which to understand these relations, which you've now conceptualized by speaking about Klee's spirit. And maybe we can find some other words and think about the pros and cons for those. All right. So let me start with the first topic about the political dimensions and how important is knowledge when looking at abstract art. You said the wonderful phrase, that some of the, when you spoke about the landscapes, that some of the gestures suggest to you. And these gestures suggesting specific landscapes, specific animals, etc., were later juxtaposed by your very deep knowledge about the politics of the time. How important do you think is it for viewers to know the history of South Asia, to know the political frictions when looking at these artworks?
Thanks so much, Yo. That's I love these four topics, so I'm excited. Yeah, I think so. One of the reasons that we have this narrative about South Asia and modernism and figuration comes out of Geeta Kapoor's very important criticism around in which in the 60s, the late 60s, she is trying very hard to valorize, to make legitimate modernisms of all kinds at a moment when no one was taking any of these artists seriously, right? They were all considered derivative. And so what she wanted to do was to counter a narrative that privileged abstraction in the way that Clement Greenberg, an American critic, was sort of pushing it, in which one could, for Greenberg, and this is a little bit of a simplification, but for Greenberg, one could look at a work of art without any political background at all. And the whole idea was that you could stand in front of the work and just sort of, I don't know, have some sort of experience of it. I've always sort of thought of this a little bit derisively because it feels very, it feels very, I don't know, like only certain people are going to have the right experience in front of the work of art, right? But for Greenberg, a good work of art, you shouldn't have to know any politics. It should just be speaking to you through the paint. Somehow the paint and the material is going to just enfold you and you're going to be changed, or you're going to have an aesthetic experience in front of it. And I think that Kapoor was writing against this idea to try to make very clear that what Indian artists were doing was legitimate and that it's okay to be modern and to do figuration. And at the time, I think that polemic was really important. And so one of the things that gestures, one of the interventions that I want to make in my thinking and writing is that was very important at the time. And now we need to go back and think about all of the art and artists in South Asia that fell out of that category. So that's partly why I think it's important to rethink what this abstraction spectrum might look like. But also, I think it's important to not let go of the political in the context of this abstraction, to not let go of the historical anchor in the context of this abstraction. So absolutely, viewers can come to Panikkar, and I encourage you to go to Trivandrum, where you can see 60 some works of his. And you can go to that gallery and look at it and know nothing about Panikkar, and you will get something out of it. You will have an aesthetic experience. You might even learn some of the things that I've been trying to sort of show you in this talk of close looking and questioning, this kind of thing. But if you then add the layer of, wait, he's living in Madras in the 60s and working on language, and this was the time of anti-Hindi riots and self-immolations and all kinds of politics around language, particularly in the South, then you get this other layer of, okay, well, what does that mean? When you think about even more broadly that he and Shakir Ali and others are working in a post-partition India in a generation or so after that, then you add another layer of politics, another layer of history. And so I think it's really important. And when you add the fact that he's surrounded at the Madras Art School by artists who are from all over the South, speaking all different languages from all different kinds of backgrounds, again, like these little bits of information start to add up, such that you get more layers of you can add those in to your formal analysis to build up a richer interpretation. And I think that's true of all abstract art. There's no, as I tried to show with Barnett Newman, like you can go and have a Greenbergian aesthetic experience in front of Barnett Newman, but if you think about it in terms of kind of Christian derived engagement with the post-war period and creation, transformation, transcendence, then you start to have a slightly different understanding of his work. So I think it's both and. It's completely okay to not know anything, but at the same time, that helps to enrich your experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this tension between like formal approach and formalistic reading or looking at artworks and a more informed, more knowledgeable way of looking is something that is crucial, I would say, for art historians and for curators to be aware of. And just to push a little harder, also because we were in this context of the project that's being developed about Barwe and Klee, and the question, which viewer knows what when looking at a Klee or a Barwe, that's also very culturally specific, maybe also even generationally specific, depending on education, etc. So in a potential exhibition bringing together Panneke and Klee or Barwe and Klee, what would you say? How much background information about which artist should be given to the audience? Should we expose them to a more formalistic experience where they really are invited to look in a classical white cube presentation? Or does it make sense to include both background information on the artists and cultural contexts in Swiss and Germany and in India?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, well, I'm, as an art historian, and actually as I have had some curatorial experience, but I'm not a curator. So my medium is writing, right? So I am a big believer in giving more of the context. I think having moments in the exhibition where you can where you can sit with the object, where you're encouraged to sort of have a more long period in front of the object is good. But I think it's not enough to just have sort of the small labels of here's the artist's name and the title, especially since so many abstract works are untitled, which is unhelpful. So I think there's a kind of there's a way in which one can a curatorial practice in which one can give small pieces of the background that are digestible in dialogue with the works themselves, such that in some ways the information doesn't overwhelm the paintings. So I might have not put everything up front, but intersperse it so that you can move between a couple of Klee paintings and the Barwe or the Panneke or the other artists that you want to put in the exhibition, and get the ideal for me would be to enable the visitor to ask questions, right? To come away with a sense of questioning, of critically engaging with both the work and the history and the context. So there would be some sort of balance there. I'm not sure what that would be, and I admire curators who are able to do that well, because it's quite difficult, actually.
Well, that's quite a prompt for the project.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll take it.
Okay.
With Raju, with my co-curator, let's see what we come up with.
Okay, excellent.
I think your focus on abstraction and on the kind of humanist, I don't know if we can use that word, but almost like humanistic interests in abstract art. The question about communication, how do we communicate? what is our relation to other human beings and also to nature? What does it mean to look at the moon if there's a human drawn border next to me? I think this reading of abstract art, this interest in abstract art, is becoming increasingly important with the rise of identity politics all over the world. So I think there's a lot to discover here. I think I'm now going to switch orders of the 4 topics because what we just talked about, I think it kind of more leads into the question about gender, and then we can talk about materiality after that. And there is this general question, and there have been lots of curatorial projects about it. There are some curatorial projects now about it, particularly in the United States, for example, rediscovering women in abstract expressionism, because often when abstraction is being shown, or when abstract movements are rediscovered, so to say, by art historians, by curators, it's first the men who are being shown and spoken about. So there's this general question from my side. You mentioned Nazreen Mohammadi. Are there further abstract artists from South Asia you would want the audience to know? Wait, there was
Mrinalini Mukherjee was also,
and Turkey.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, for me, the question, you're absolutely right, that abstraction is often seen, and this also comes out of that 1950s moment, as a kind of masculinist practice. And I think that many of these curatorial projects, I was lucky enough to see the Women in Abstract Expressionism show, and it was incredible. And many of the, there is a much wider range of people working in abstraction, not just in terms of gender, but also there have been a lot of erasures of minority voices within American American culture. I'm most particularly aware, because I teach these materials, I'm aware of sort of the Asian American context and the ways in which abstract artists within Asian American communities were just completely ignored. So I think in this context of South Asia, I think what's interesting is that the gendered makeup of artists, particularly in the very early stages after independence, was very male driven. But in the kind of second, what people often talk about as the second generation after independence, we start to see more and more women participating. And in fact, in more recent years, in the last 15 years, it's those women who have really grounded the practice, like sort of what South Asian art is. So I'm thinking here of Arpita Singh, of Nilima Sheikh, of a whole range of women artists, Pushpamala, others. And so I really wanted to think about Madhvi Parekh, to think about Mrinalini Mukherjee, to think about Nazreen Mohammadi, because in some ways, part of what their work is on this boundary, is in this spectrum of abstraction, and I think so often has been read. Many of these artists' works have been read solely through the lens of like gender or domesticity or childhood, or like these kinds of themes. And I think that actually they deserve better than that, right? I know they deserve better than that, right? They deserve a kind of fuller engagement. And so bringing them into this conversation is really important. And I would also just say that the other vector that we often don't talk about that I think is so important is the diversity of both of religion across and religious backgrounds across the artists that we talk about with modern India, of caste backgrounds that we talk about, and of economic backgrounds. So some of them are coming from quite wealthy urban contexts, and some of them are coming from very rural spaces like Raghav Kanaria. And so to think about the ways in which these artists bring those different experiences into their work is again something that I'd like to do. So the identity question, I think, is really a very broad one that we need to continue to interrogate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Picking up on the identity question, going beyond gender, you showed us this image of Nasreen Mohammadi, another untitled one from 1960, with a kind of ink, what looked to me like ink washed, abstract writing.
Yeah.
And then you said that, you know, Mohammadi is often compared to Agnes Martine, and I was thinking, wait, I see a reference to East Asia rather than to the US here. And then given the religious background of the family of the artist, I was thinking if this comparison to Agnes Martin, and we see that often with South Asian artists, South Asian women artists, Amrita Shergill is the Frida Kahlo of India, etc. How helpful is that? What do we do to our readers or our listeners' imaginations if we pop in names like Agnes Martin when looking at Mohammadi?
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. One of the struggles I had when starting this project on Panikkar and thinking about how am I going to, I really wanted to bring him into dialogue with Paul Klee in a deep, serious way, not in the Amrita Shergill is the Frida Kahlo of India kind of way. And so this goes back to this method around relation, around comparison, around sometimes I've used Alex Segerman, who's a scholar of Egyptian modernism. She uses the concept of the constellation. So I've used that in my work as well. As a kind of a metaphor, a way of trying to think about how can we relate people without having this kind of dismissive one-to-one, they're the Agnes Martin of India. And how can we also honor connections that really are there? So Nasreen Mohammadi is studying with, or is not studying with, is working next to Gaitonde in Bombay for many years. And Gaitonde is another artist who I didn't bring into the talk, but who is also an abstract artist who looks to East Asia, as many artists in South Asia, as many artists in America do. And so to think about the ways in which we have this interpenetration of different kinds of aesthetic forms overlaid with different artists' works, I think that's really important. So in a constellation around Nasreen, there would be an Agnes Martin star. It might be very dim. And then there would be maybe a stronger Gaitonde star, and there would be there would be an East Asian cluster. But there would also then be something about landscape, something about photography, right? So thinking about the ways in which we can make more complex these connections across artists. And as Mira opened the conversation saying, I think the other thing to think about is chronology. Of course, as a historian, chronology is important, but there are different ways of telling histories. There are different ways of thinking about time and memory and connection. And so suggesting that Paul Klee is sort of floating around India in the 60s and 70s, 30 years after his death, is, I think, very real. I think he's there, or something is there called Paul Klee. What that thing is, we don't know. But I think there's a kind of, or it's different for everyone. So I want to think about Agnes Martin floating around India as well, or East Asian ink painting floating around India. Like, how does that work? And then Indian artists shaping how Japanese artists are thinking about their practice too, right? So all of these interconnections, I think, would be important.
I know you have more questions prepared. May I jump in here, because I think I have two questions from our audience which would fit really well right now. Is that all right?
Yes, great.
one question, I'm not sure if I get it 100%, but I'm gonna try, and I apologize if I don't phrase it correctly, is when it comes to these comparisons, there was a question about the process of making art. The person said that there's a certain kind of sensibility that gives birth to a certain idiom, to a certain distinct idiom that an artist might create. And our questioner was here specifically interested in Barwe. What's that sensibility around Barwe? What's that sensibility around Klee? And maybe my question on top of that is like, if we think about these constellations, if we think about these things floating around, do we think about, you know, the final end product of an artwork? Do we think about these processes of whatever these sensibilities might be? How do we do that? So that's one of the questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like this idea of sensibility, of I sometimes use the term idiom because I like the idea of it kind of being like a language metaphor where you have your own idiom that's shared within your artistic culture, within the things that you have been in dialogue with, the languages that you've been experimenting with. And I think that, well, for Barwe, for example, one thing one could talk about, and this actually connects with the materiality theme that Yo was going to bring up, is the fact that he worked in the weavers' service centers, making designs for weavers to then create and sell on the wider market. And a lot of artists in this 1960s and 70s period did do this, have a kind of design element of their practice. And so to think, and Raghav Kaneria is inspired by his mother's embroidery, for example, in a lot of his work. So there's a way in which there's a kind of atmosphere or environment of inputs, of absorption that an artist takes into their sensibility that then one can sometimes see in the works. I don't want to, one of the things that art historians get a good sense of as you sort of do this over and over again is you figure out where the boundary is. This is actually the tricky part. It's sort of when are you going too far in your pushing your reading, and when is it legitimate? And one of the ways that we can limit ourselves or understand that limit is by looking at a lot of works by the same artist. And what you start to build up is you start to sort of speak their language in a certain way. It's very helpful if the artist is alive and you can have a conversation with them, but often they are not. So sometimes it's more about just trying to have a conversation with them through gathering as much material together as you can, gathering as many of the works together as you can. So in that painting that I started with by Barwe, I really do think that the choice of silk as the medium is so important because it has this connection to that experience of working with weavers, working with people who are themselves working in that medium of cloth. And then the selection of those flowers at the top is just so evocative of designs from, carpets or embroideries or textiles in various ways. And so I think there's a sensibility there that he's letting some of that come into his work. And one of the things about Barwe that's actually quite difficult for me is that his work is so varied that kind of like Klee, actually. So you just have such a variety of different idioms. And this is the other thing to keep in mind. Artists change. Artists are also quite talented and they can do a whole range of things, right? So there's not one thing that they do. And so trying to think with them as they experiment and develop is, I think, quite helpful.
Thank you for that reply. And just a little comment on Barwe, because my co-curator for this project, Raju, also commented he was so lucky to meet Barwe when he was still alive, and said that Barwe often said that he is interested in the concrete, in the abstract, and plays with and goes in between. And I guess that's also the same with Klee, and then we end up with this variety of different, almost feels like different idioms or styles.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to add on one more question, if that's all right,
Mm.
from Marianne, who's my colleague from the Zentrum Paul Klee. She spoke in the last webinar, and she has a question, which I thought is fitting now because we were speaking about these constellations or different words for that, and how Agnes Martin might be floating around in India, or the other way around, or how Clay might be floating around in India, and we're not quite sure how. And she had a bit of a specific question on that, and I wonder if you might know, because I'm not very sure. She thanks you very much for this talk, and then says that for me, it's quite striking that Clay's thought about pictorial configuration has had such an influence in the 20th century, and not only in art, but also music, for instance. The principles of composition, as Clay noted them in his text, seem to be very universal. So she said, I was just wondering whether Indian artists knew mainly the pedagogical sketchbook that you've been mentioning, or whether they also had access to the thinking eye. And I think they did, but I wonder if you
Yeah.
have, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think they had both. And actually, Panikkar is quite, well, speaking to artists, they can tell you that they've seen both of these texts, but Panikkar is quite helpful because he also has an editorial practice where he publishes journals, and he co-published a book and a journal called Art Trends for many years. And these include quotes from different texts, including Clay quotes. They also, he had access to Will Groman's book on Clay as well. So there's sort of books about Clay circulating, which would have had reproductions as well as, I mean, not great reproductions, but some sense of the work itself. And then a lot of people in South Asia point to the 1922 exhibition in Calcutta, which Stella Kramarish helped to organize around the Bauhaus. And I think that was important, but not obviously because the artists I'm talking about didn't go to that exhibition. They were too young. But because Calcutta at the time, those ideas circulated, those images circulated, and then teachers from Calcutta went everywhere in India. So Panikkar's predecessor at Madras was D.P. Roy Chowdhury, who comes from Bengal. And so you get this kind of, oh, I don't know if I am frozen or if, oh, okay, you're back.
You're back, yes, great.
Okay, yeah, I'm back. Anyway, so the teachers from Bengal spread across the country. So I think there is a sense in which, you know, second, third, fourth hand, people are understanding that there is this thing called the Bauhaus, there is this Paul Klee. And in fact, when Panikkar goes to Europe, he doesn't just go to London and Paris, he goes to Bern. So, you know, I think there's a definite anchor here, both in terms of the writing and in terms of the trying to go and see the actual works.
Amazing, thank you so much. I'm going to give back to you, Jo.
If I might pick up on that Bauhaus and Calcutta exhibition that you just mentioned, Rebecca, and I think you might be frozen again.
Oh,
Rebecca?
yeah, I can see you, Jo. Okay,
you can
I'm
hear.
back. Okay, yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
Because I'm now just thinking aloud. To me, there's still a missing link, because that exhibition in Calcutta did not only show clay. It showed many different artists, paperwork of many different Bauhaus artists. And in fact, the only painting from that exhibition that was sold to the Tagore family was by Sophie Körner. So not a Klee, it was an artist that is barely known today. And Kramarish and also others from Bengal who toured to India and who talked about European modern art did not only speak about clay. So I'm wondering what happened between this exhibition and these talks that featured many European modern artists, many Bauhaus artists, and also others, and the almost not singular, but very strong focus on clay. So what was it in Clay's work that apparently created a resonance with what South Asian artists were looking for at the time? What did they find in Clay that they did not find in others? And that's,
Yeah,
we would
this is
probably
great.
have to look in the diaries or in the minds, which isn't possible anymore, except for if we learn to talk to all the floating spirits. But that's something I'm very much struggling with, because there's this,
Yeah.
why clay?
Yeah, no, this is great. And I actually think part of the answer is it's not just clay. So I think there's a lot of people are looking at Kandinsky as well. I think it's driven by, honestly, it's driven by the texts. And this is actually the distinction, is that Paul Klee's sketchbook gets translated fairly quickly and circulated around in English and circulated around the world. So not just in South Asia, but I've heard from colleagues in the Middle East and elsewhere that Paul Klee is also an interlocutor for artists there. And I believe part of it is riding on the fact that they can get their hands on books that have texts. And anyone who's looked at the pedagogical sketchbook, it's this lovely, small, tiny book that has sketches in it. And so it's in some ways it is perfect for artists, right? Like it is in fact his part of his lectures, right, from the Bauhaus. So this is his lecture notes. And it's not a ponderous philosophical book or an art historical book. It's a how-to book. And this, I think, is crucial for why clay becomes so important across the world. But he is not alone. And in fact, looking at the editorial practice in Cholamandal, where Panikkar is living and co-editing these projects, I mean, he also quotes Van Gogh and Van Gogh's letters to his brother quite a lot. He'll quote a whole range of different modern critics. So Herbert Reed pops up a decent amount in the quotations, and Herbert Reed wrote about clay, right? So there's a kind of Kandinsky comes up quite a lot. So I think it's about, because especially in the 50s and 60s, there's not a lot of good circulating reproductions. And the artists, only a very few number of artists are getting grants and funding to go to Europe, to go to America, where they would see actual paintings by clay, right? Because these paintings are everywhere in the North Atlantic. It's actually that they have access to clay, the thinker and painter, through his translated words. And I think that's the crucial element.
And I think,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that's a very, very important point, because that means that in this constellation in which Klee and Barwe and Panikkar and others are connected through an interest in pushing the boundaries of figuration towards abstraction, that means that it's not primarily, like if we look at this constellation, Klee and South Asian artists, it might not even be Klee's paintings we have to put as a bright star in that constellation, but it's really the writings and the sketches and the writings, which also allows us to pin the spirit of clay, which you've invoked a bit more precisely.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I've done, so for example, with Madhvi Parekh, where, this is the pedagogical sketchbook is what she used almost as her textbook, right? And people talk about her work in terms of the lozenge, like the dots and different repeated things that she uses, the lines and markings that she uses. But if we actually go back to the pedagogical sketchbook and look at it, and look carefully at it, and then look carefully at Madhvi Parekh's work, you can see a much deeper engagement with Paul Klee than just, oh, I see, it's lines and symbols, right? It's not just that, it's much, much more. So I think it behooves us to look both at the texts again, but also at what Klee is doing with his own ideas in his works, and then what these artists are doing with Klee's ideas as they interpret them and rethink them.
This is super interesting conversation. I have to think about the last webinar where we also talked about the texts a lot and talked about that. Marianne again gave us this insight that Klee also, because if you go not to the sketchbook, what has been kind of a condensed form that was done, I think, for the Bauhaus, but if you actually go to his lectures, they are incredibly complicated to read, even in German, even in the original language. And it's been said that Klee said that it's not like he knows the way or this is the way. It's more about this is one way to think about it, and let's try that now. So it's also really interesting how what gets taken from that, what then travels on in what kind of form, and so what is in deep engagement with Paul Klee actually? How is that possible? How do you do that? That's yeah, I feel like that's it's really interesting and very interesting for our project as well because Barwe has also been writing and publishing books. So it's not just bringing artworks into a dialogue. It's really yeah, that sensibility was a great question, or these texts and all of that, or all of these packages that we might get
Yeah.
our hands.
Yeah. And some of these editorial projects and writing projects help us to see what these artists saw in clay, right? Like which pieces of clay are they taking? And I think importantly, which pieces of that inspiration are they rejecting? Because I think also it's important to note the kind of sometimes you go and visit a place or meet an artist as an artist and you have there's no reaction, right? Or there's even a negative reaction, right? So I think there's a sense in which we also need to honor that, like what's missing in that transmission.
Which is this question about creativity. You asked what's the end of your talk, right? What is creativity and what is creation? And I think part of it can be reconstructed and understood, and part of the creative process are just going to not be graspable with words.
Right, exactly. That idea of kind of, I think that a lot of, for me, as an art historian, it's wonderful when I find an artist who I think is grappling exactly with that in their work, or that has chosen to be an artist, or is driven to be an artist, usually precisely because that's the only place that they can work out some of these questions, right? And so for me, that's where the sort of spectrum of abstraction that I've shown today is so powerful. For me, it's looking at other human beings grappling with, how do I know what I know? What is this language? How do I understand what this person is telling me, even in the same language? Like, how do we even meet in the middle? How do I incorporate this idea into my thinking, into my work, into my life? How do we explain something like a seed turning into a plant? That's amazing, right? How do we grapple with that? So thinking about these incredible forms, and then also thinking about the very difficult 20th century, 21st century tensions and problems within our world, whether that's gender dynamics or politics of geopolitics or language politics or other kinds of tensions. So I think this is the power of art for me, is getting at these questions, not through writing a long book about them, but through exploring and grappling with, materiality in art, developing a sensibility. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are kind of at time. Do you want to ask one last question maybe, or because I know you had some more, or?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca just kind of, brought us towards the materiality topic, and I want to pick up on that, and that's going to be my last question or observation. In the paintings you showed us, the gestures of landscapes and the gestures of gardens, animals, they barely ever made any references to industrialized societies. But there was one in the painting of Barwe, which was a landscape with the crow. And at the very front, there was something that looked like a little, some kind of little mechanical object, or even industrial object. And in the materiality that Barwe used, and also some of the other artists are used, the industrialized society becomes very visible through the colors, through the acid colors, through the aluminium. but then it's absent in the subject matter.
Mm.
What do you make of that? How does abstraction, how do the interests in the edges of figuration leaning towards abstraction, all the very basic human questions involved in
Yeah,
that, how do they connect with not only the political specific point in time, but also
yeah.
the point where society in terms of industrialization stands?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because you're right. In the examples that I chose, with the exception of that, maybe with the exception also of Canaria's sort of earlier sculptures where he's working in the metal forms that I showed you the installation image of. Um, and I would also add potentially the kind of the tools and materials that Nazreen Mohammadi uses for her drawings are, these are high-end drafting tools, basically. So there is a kind of engineering aspect to her work that I find interesting. But you're right. I think there's an that is either missing or it comes out in other ways. It comes out through that, as you said, through that materiality. And I think, and interestingly, that painting by Barwe is also later, right? It's 1990s, I think. So there's something about the 60s and 70s where perhaps the presence of industry is not something that that these artists are incorporating into their work in terms of the subject matter. The use of aluminum ground by Panikar is partly, I think, due to the fact that he's surrounded by sculptors who are using sheet metal in their work. So partly, I think it's about an opportunistic, oh, there's this sheet of aluminum, I'm going to see if I can paint on it kind of thing, and less about a gesture towards industry or modern technologies in that way. But it is something that I think we all need to think about more, sort of how are these artists grappling with big questions of something like information transmission, which in the 60s and 70s is a huge theme across the world as it kind of explodes in a certain way through television, through all kinds of media. And it's something that the later Bauhaus in America is also grappling with. I'm thinking here of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, for example, dealing with sort of how do we understand all of this visual imagery. And so I see Panikar as in dialogue with that, but as not like working in video art, because these kinds of materials are not available to a lot of South Asian artists in the 60s and 70s, but instead working in the language of painting to try to understand some of these same questions. And I will say that in another project, it's happening in photography. So there is definitely a thread within photography at the time that is grappling with these kinds of industrial abstraction aesthetic questions that are quite interesting.
Thank you.
So, yeah. Thank you both. This was a lovely conversation. I'm so excited that we were able to do this. And thanks to the audience as well for joining us and asking such great questions. This is wonderful.
The audience has commented more also, and thank you to both of you. So I haven't translated all of them into the conversation, but yes, they're really thankful. I'm super thankful to both of you. I feel like we could go on for another hour, but also in respect of our Indian colleagues for whom it's like a little bit later in the day already. I think this is a great moment to bring it to a close. And thank you for this last question you on materiality. I think it's also something for our project that is going to be super key on both ends, maybe as a last comment, because we're extremely lucky that the Saprosa Museum has a collection of Barwe's paintings and works. So, for example, the first one that you've shown us, Rebecca, that's going to be part of the exhibition. And Barwe has been playing with different kinds of paints and industrial paints, for example. So it might come in through that. And then on the other hand, we have Klee's works, which are so fragile, and he has experimented in such a great degree with different materials that we can't bring them to India. There's no way. So thinking about facsimiles, thinking about reproducing work, thinking about how do we distribute work information even today is like a really key question in there that I'm also super excited to get into now in the process of starting to prepare the exhibition. So yes, thank you both so much for this.
Thank
It was
you.
a huge pleasure. I want to end this with a few thank yous and a few advertising bits, if I'm allowed, because I would also really love to thank, of course, all the audience questions, everybody attending today, for the comments that were coming, even more other artists being thrown into the conversation that has been going here in the chat. So really amazing. I also want to thank Shripad, who's our technical lead, and the team. Without that, it wouldn't be possible. And I would really like to thank also all our collaborating partners, which don't really have representative here today. Most of all, my co-curator Raju Sotar, who has been speaking in the last webinar. So if you want to hear his account on Barwe, as I mentioned earlier, he also knew him while Barwe was still alive and had a lot of conversations. You can hear that in the recording that's coming up online in January about the first webinar. And Raj also initiated this whole project out of being in conversation. So I also really appreciate that there's this personal lead into, which I think plays a role. I just wanted to mention that because I think it plays a role with everything that we've just been discussing and talking about. And a thank you to the whole Saposa Museum, who's going to host the exhibition as well. Thank you to the Zentrum Paul Klee, who has been an absolutely amazing collaborator and is still, and the Goethe-Institut Pune, who is also pushing this and making this happen, to Reno and Saili and Pranav, who are working with us there. And if you want to know more, oh, this is me, this is my cue for sharing the screen. If you want to know more, you can have a look at our website, so that you will find, if you go to the Goethe-Institut Pune website and then search under current projects, the project intersections and interventions will come up. There you also have a contact. So if you would like to get in touch, any of you, with more questions or comments, then please do that. We're always looking forward to that. And I'm going to stop sharing this, and also stay tuned, because this webinar series is going to continue next year. We're still finalizing the dates, but there's more to come. And with that, again, thank you to all of you, and I wish you a nice rest of your day or evening of this Saturday weekend.